thank you for coming. Thank you, Emily, and welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here today. I give over 42 different topics, and I must confess to you that this is one of my favorites, if not my favorite subject to speak on. So I'm delighted to be able to share this marvelous story with you. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. There are so many places that I could begin. Hundreds of books have been written about this remarkable woman, this great humanitarian who was the longest-serving First Lady in American history, 12 years. She was also a politician in her own right, an international diplomat, an activist, a writer, a speaker, a UN representative, and most importantly, she was the bearer of hope to the underprivileged of all races, religions, and nations. She would slowly change from being a shy, awkward child, starved for love and recognition, into an amazing woman with great sensitivity to the underprivileged of the world. She would always have sympathy for the underdog, and that would include laborers, women, blacks, and children. Her constant effort to improve the lot of the disadvantaged would make her one of the most beloved and most revered women of her generation. She was called the conscience of FDR. Perhaps she should have been called the conscience of this country. She would receive many accolades and titles, including foremost political woman, most remarkable woman in the 20th century, first woman of the world, to name a few. She became famous on her own as a major political force, as well as a person who would be recognized throughout the world. Her influence was truly, truly global. Her journey to greatness started out in an unauspicious manner. She was born October 11th, 1884, into a privileged and distinguished family, or so it seemed on the surface, but it was not ideal. Her young life was filled with recurrent tragedy and anguish. Behind this rich, well-born facade, there was a world of disappointment, alcoholism, and betrayal. Her mother, Anna Hall, was a noted beauty. She had lost her own father when she was 17, and she escaped helping raise her 6 siblings by marrying early. She was 19 when she wed the dashing, slightly eccentric 23-year-old Elliott Roosevelt. He, too, was from a socially prominent family. This couple were both active, popular socialites in this aristocratic, elite, and glamorous society of that time. They were married in one of the most, as was said, brilliant weddings of the season. That's how all the society columns put it. His family tree was equally distinguished. His older brother was Theodore Roosevelt, who would one day later become president. But in these early years, it was Elliott, the son who showed the most promise. He also, though, showed a troubling lack of purpose and a constant search for pleasure. He began to develop some serious but undiagnosed health issues. His excessive drinking would lead to severe alcoholism. He was also addicted to laudanum. Anna was 20 when she gave birth to Eleanor, her first child. Eleanor said her lovely mother was one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen, and most people agreed with her. But she was also cold and aloof, especially to her plain, shy little daughter. Her mother thought from the very earliest days that this daughter was doomed to social failure, and to this mother, social success was everything. This mother felt manners were more important than feelings, and that beauty was the most important attribute of all. She seemed disappointed in Eleanor, who was quiet and rather homely. She shared her negative feelings, making Eleanor feel even plainer, even more unloved. She mocked the little girl's appearance and teased her because of her somber, serious manner. She even called her Granny because the child was so serious, even at the age of 2. From the first, Eleanor was the recipient of her mother's coldest attention. One day, after carefully studying her little girl, Anna told her daughter, You have no looks, but see to it that you have manners. Eleanor would feel that lack of love and disappointment her entire life. Her mother's disapproval would permanently affect her own self-image. She became reserved and deferential. Now, her father, that was a completely different story. Eleanor adored him, and she would romanticize him throughout her life because he showed her warmth and love. He called her Little Nell, and he encouraged her to excel, to be courageous and brave. He promoted her education, too. Although she rarely admitted it, she was never totally secure with him either, because she never knew when he might abandon her emotionally or even literally. When she was about 7, he took her on a walk with their dogs on a leash. He left her standing under the canopy of his club while he ran in for a quick drink. She stood there holding that leash on those dogs. She stood there for 6 hours. And finally, she saw her unconscious father being carried out. But she kept standing there. She kept waiting because that's what she had been told to do. And finally, a kindly doorman came and escorted her home. And then that sad little girl lost both her parents. Her mother contracted diphtheria and died when she was 29. Eleanor was now sent to live with her grandmother. Elliot, her beloved father, would die 18 months later following a seizure and a failed suicide attempt. He was 34. She said she felt utter desolation at the loss of her father, and those feelings of abandonment at his death would stay with her for a very long time. She would now live a somber, quiet life with her grandmother. But when she was 15, her grandmother arranged for her to go to boarding school in Europe. It would be the salvation of Eleanor. It would be the making of Eleanor Roosevelt. This would be her only really formal education. She left for Allenswood in London in 1899. It was a prestigious school that offered young women an education that emphasized their responsibility in society and their personal independence, whether they were married or not. The headmistress of this school was a feminist. Her ideas were considered dangerous for that time. Women had to learn, women had to argue, women had to resist and be forceful. Eleanor, who was bilingual, fit in beautifully at this French-speaking school, and there she became more confident. She stood straighter, showing off her height. She was really 6 feet tall. She was taught to dress in the Parisian style. Those wonderful 3 years at Allenswood would end when her grandmother Hall insisted she return to New York to make her debut. New York's leading papers were rapturous, announcing Eleanor's coming out. They recalled her mother's sparkling social leadership. But to Eleanor, those balls, those debutante presentations were utter agony because she was taller than most of the young men. She feared having a blank space on her dance court. She was not used to talking with men. She felt she was the first girl in her mother's family who was not beautiful, and she was deeply ashamed of that fact. It was a period of great pressure for her. Now, actually, Eleanor was a lot more attractive than she ever gave herself credit for. At this time, she was slim and elegant and lithe. She had beautiful blue eyes and little gorgeous pale gold luxurious hair that fell below her waist. She did have slightly protruding teeth that could have been easily fixed if her grandmother would have spent the money. Many of the young men commented on her attractiveness. She did have a rather strange voice. It was very high-pitched, and if you hear her today, you'll recognize it immediately. The young men thought she was attractive, but she never, ever seemed able to believe it herself. And then one young man began to appear more and more frequently. He was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, her 5th cousin once removed. This now began a year of frequent encounters. He was the same height as she was. He was handsome and charming. He reminded her a little bit of her father. They shared similar interests and dreams, and he made her laugh. At this time, she was also being courted by several other suitors. She visited Hyde Park to see his mother, and she was stunned by Sarah Delano Roosevelt's austere beauty. On the surface, she was gracious, but Sarah made it a point to remind Eleanor how her mother had publicly humiliated her when she was 2 by always calling her Granny. Franklin was Sarah's only child, and she was totally dependent on him for comfort and companionship after his father died. She was not going to let go of Franklin easily or quickly. As he and Eleanor became more and more involved, he kept their growing relationship a secret from his mother. And when he finally got to the point where he had to admit they were making plans for a future, his stunned mother insisted they keep their relationship a secret for at least a year. Eleanor learned Sarah could be very cold and very disapproving, and initially never missed an opportunity to keep the two of them apart. The parallels between Eleanor's mother and Franklin's mother are painfully obvious. They were both very beautiful women. They were both cold and disapproving of Eleanor. Neither one seemed to be able to truly love her. But Eleanor was very patient and considerate. She hoped that one day Franklin's mother could learn to love her. During this period, Eleanor began doing volunteer work in the growing movement of social reform. The settlement movement had been founded by the Junior League. Working with this organization, Eleanor now taught calisthenics and dancing to deprived children, and she got there by public transportation. And instead of being impressed, her family were appalled by these actions. But improving the lives of others would become the cornerstone of her life vision. And finally, after that long year, Eleanor and Franklin were married on March 17th, 1905, St. Patrick's Day. The bride was described as beautiful, regal, magnificent. They said she wore a diamond crescent that held her veil, and she wore a dog collar made of pearls and diamonds. There were over 200 guests at this wedding. She was escorted down the aisle by her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt. He upstaged the event, as he did most events, and I have to share with you my favorite Teddy Roosevelt story, even though you've probably heard me recite this several times. His daughter always said he loved being the center of attention. She said her father always wanted to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. That's how much Teddy loved attention. There was another major distraction at this ceremony. They were almost drowned out by the ancient order of Hibernians who were marching past the open window of the church, lustily singing the Wearing of the Green. But they got through the beautiful ceremony, and they went on their European honeymoon. Eleanor would now begin her marriage as orchestrated by her domineering mother-in-law. And just as it had been with her own mother, she could not please this woman of the house. They returned from their honeymoon, and Eleanor was pregnant, and she found that Sarah had rented them a house 3 blocks from her own. Sarah had completely furnished it, and Sarah had hired all of the servants. Eleanor had wanted a home and a family of her own. It was something she had never really ever had, and she still would not have it. She found now that at the dining room table, Franklin was at one end, and her mother-in-law was at the other end, and Eleanor just sat along the side with the children as they came along. There were these 2 big, comfortable wing chairs on either side of the fireplace. Eleanor's mother-in-law, Sarah, sat in one. Franklin sat in the other. Eleanor sat on the floor or just anywhere she wanted. There didn't seem to be a specific place for her in her own home. Eleanor's efforts to appease her mother-in-law were monumental. She truly wanted to be loved and to belong. And for the next decade, she would submerge and distort her own needs and try to become more like Sarah. And that included accepting their class arrogance and some egregious racism. This power grab would extend even to Eleanor's children. Her first child, Anna Eleanor, was born May 3rd, 1905, and Sarah went to great lengths to seduce and captivate each of the 6 children as they came along. She would repeatedly assert to them, "I was your real mother. Eleanor merely bore you." She sabotaged every effort Eleanor made, leading her to later say that the early years of her marriage were the loneliest in her adult life. Now, in 1908, they moved into Siamese twin towers. They were designed by Sarah. They were exactly alike. And you could slide the door on one, and Sarah could step into the other house, back and forth. 5 children would be raised in that house. And Anna, the only daughter, the firstborn, and then came James, Franklin, Elliot, Franklin Delano, and John. The first son, named Franklin, died when he was 7 months old from an influenza and a heart condition. Eleanor was devastated and suffered from depression for months. But there was an important change on the horizon. Following law school and some business ventures, 28-year-old FDR was now asked to run for the New York State Senate. This was much to Eleanor's delight and much to his mother's dismay. He now ran as an independent and a progressive Democrat, and he won. They moved to Albany, and for the first time, they had a home without Sarah. Eleanor enthusiastically became involved in this new phase of her husband's life, and within weeks, she had won over the political notables with her amazing capacity to listen, to understand, and to care. Her enthusiasm and her separation from her domineering mother-in-law now reinvigorated this marriage. Franklin realized his wife was a great political asset, and he listened to her as he did to few others. He had supported Wilson for president, and now the popular young politician was offered the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy by the president. It was a job Franklin wanted, and he accepted. Eleanor had a delightful comment after meeting the president's wife. Speaking of Mrs. Wilson, "Well, she seemed like a nice, intelligent woman, but not one overburdened with charm." Eleanor now began her role as a political career wife and soon as a political activist. When the Roosevelts moved to Washington in 1913, they were as close as they had ever been. They seemed to now have a real understanding and a sense of union and common purpose. They were tender and loving with each other, and most of the time they were happy. Eleanor was 29, healthy, robust, and a perfect, slender Gibson girl. They met with a group of friends regularly. They would continue doing this for years. But then came the start of World War I, and that changed everything in Washington. It meant new work for Eleanor Roosevelt. She organized the Red Cross canteen. She organized the Navy Red Cross. She knitted. She gave out free wool. She served coffee and sandwiches to the soldiers and visited the wounded in the hospitals, working from 9 in the morning until long past midnight. And she thrived on this work. She thrived on being needed. But then their marriage began to change. Handsome, high-spirited FDR began to stay out later and later at parties where women flocked to him, while Eleanor began to leave earlier and earlier. Franklin hired an attractive social secretary. Her name was Lucy Mercer, and she filled in when Eleanor could not be there. Franklin and Lucy were frequently seen together, and they began to be gossip about a romance. And then, After 13 years of marriage and bearing 6 children, Eleanor's world was shattered. Franklin had been away on a trip to Europe when Eleanor received a telegram asking her to meet his ship with an ambulance and a physician. He was very ill with double pneumonia and influenza. That was the time when that Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 was raging throughout this country. But this serious illness was not the most devastating thing Eleanor would now have to face. She took over his convalescence and his nursing, and then she found a packet of letters from Lucy Mercer, a packet of love letters. She said the bottom dropped out of her world, and she immediately confronted FDR and offered him his freedom. She would rather be alone than be unwanted in her own home. She had faced that too many times in the past. She had always felt like an outsider, marginally loved and simply tolerated. To her, divorce was preferable than living like that. Sarah, Franklin's mother, was aghast when she learned of the affair. Her son had a choice: that woman or his wife, his family, and the family money. Divorce at that time would have also ended any political career he was anticipating. Franklin told Lucy he could not get a divorce, which was a lie. Franklin had agreed that he would never see Lucy again, but he would be repeatedly untrue to that promise. Eleanor suffered from this affair on numerous levels. He had not only betrayed her, but he had done it in the company of so many people they knew. It humiliated her. She was devastated, and it would take her years to regain her self-confidence. She was 34 with 5 young children to raise when this happened. But these 2 intelligent people were determined they were going to rebuild their lives, but they would now have a different relationship. It would become an unselfish partnership. They made every effort now to recover the joy that had been between them. Eleanor went to more parties, and she was determined to try to enjoy them more. Franklin spent more time with the children. He gave up Sunday golf to go to church. He even bought Eleanor thoughtful little presents. But in spite of his efforts, Eleanor continued to suffer greatly during this period. She lost weight. She rarely smiled. She was depressed. She seemed to have lost the will to live. But then Eleanor resolved to establish an independent life that would free them both to live according to their own individual needs and wants. And that may be the greatest achievement in her personal story. 1917 would become a turning point for Eleanor. It was the time of the war, and war horrified Eleanor. She marshaled aid now for the Red Cross and for other charitable organizations. She would work tirelessly to improve the lives of men suffering from PTSD. And eventually, following those war years, she would take on every social problem in this country, every progressive issue: racial justice, international peace, collective bargaining, human rights, women's rights, rights for every person around the globe. Now, in 1920, Franklin resigned as Secretary of the Navy, now to enter national politics. He was selected to be the running mate of the Democratic presidential candidate, Governor James Fox. He campaigned vigorously, but the ticket lost, as was expected. Then, a year later, in 1921, a tragedy struck while the family was vacationing at Campobello Island. Franklin had gone for a vigorous swim, and when he came in, he was complaining of a chill. And the next day, he had a high fever and progressing paralysis. Experts were brought in, and the eventual diagnosis was devastating. He was suffering from the dreaded infantile paralysis from polio. He was now paralyzed from the waist down. This once vigorous man who had bounded enthusiastically upstairs 3 at a time could not walk. He could not stand without help. And at this time, there was no cure and there was no vaccine. So Eleanor now became his nurse. She slept in his room day and night for the next 3 weeks. Her terrible hurt turned into compassion. And out of this crucible of suffering and illness, their lives would be transformed once again. They would now go in different directions, but they would do it together. This tragic event would lead Eleanor to say, actually, it was a blessing. It helped fortify their union, and Franklin changed. He learned patience and persistence. This terrible ordeal would now give him strength and courage. Eleanor said they were both toughened by this life-altering event. Franklin would never, ever move again without awkwardness, difficulty, and pain. And Eleanor would now act as Franklin's stand-in. She would be his legs, his eyes, his ears, his voice. She would go where he could not go. She took on more and more leadership in various organizations, including the Democratic Party. She helped set up clubs for women. She would also take over the parental roles with her sons. She learned to swim so that now she could teach her 4 boys since Franklin was infirmed. During this period, they made new friends, Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook. Marion was a teacher and a vice principal at Todd Hunter School in Manhattan. This was a private school for girls, and Eleanor bought into that school and became a beloved teacher there. The students adored her, and she loved teaching. She taught literature, American history, and drama. Franklin recognized that Eleanor needed a place of her own, separate from her mother-in-law, so he drew up the design for a fieldstone cottage on family land. It was called Valkill, and it became Eleanor's favorite getaway. Franklin also had a second home. His retreat was a spa in Warm Springs, Georgia. He felt the warm water at the spa was beneficial for his legs, so he bought that rundown resort and turned it into a rehab center for polio victims. And then, in 1928, in spite of his severe disability, party leaders came and convinced him to run for governor. Now, this is amazing because at this time, a physical disability in this country was seen as an impediment in politics. As a result of that paralysis, Franklin wore these heavy braces on both legs. He couldn't, as I've said, stand or walk without help. But his true condition was always concealed from the public. And in spite of all those problems, he campaigned vigorously across the state, and he won a narrow victory. And now the Roosevelts moved back to Albany into the governor's mansion, and Eleanor became the First Lady of New York, part-time. They had made a deal. She would do it all. She would be the First Lady with all that it implied. But she would also continue teaching 3 days a week. This was the remarkable aspect of their partnership now. They consulted and they influenced each other, and yet they retained their own separate lives. She was serving as his personal reporter. She would visit in the hospitals, prisons, asylums. She would give him a detailed analysis when she returned of what she had witnessed. During Franklin's first term as governor, the United States went from boom to bust almost overnight with the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. Franklin's bold emergency measures gained him national attention, and it helped him be re-elected governor in 1930 by the highest margin ever recorded in New York State. His landslide victory, though, now made him a front runner for the presidential nomination in 1932. Eleanor was deeply troubled, and she feared his election as president would mean the end of any personal life for her. But in spite of her own misgivings, she became fully involved in the campaign when he was determined to be the Democratic nominee to run against Herbert Hoover. Franklin went on to win overwhelmingly, becoming the 32nd President of the United States. One of the reporters on this campaign was a woman by the name of Lorena Hickok. She was with the Associated Press. She was warm, she was witty, and she was intelligent, and she became a close personal friend of Eleanor's. The president's wife would now challenge the conventional role of First Lady. America had never seen anything like Eleanor Roosevelt. She began holding her own press conferences. She had a special women's-only press corps. She initiated meetings. She was highly independent. She refused to have a chauffeur or a police escort. She bought her own blue sports roadster and drove herself wherever she wanted to go. She flew all over this country promoting air safety. She was friends with Amelia Earhart, and the two of them took off on a well-publicized adventure wearing evening dresses in the plane. She began a daily syndicated column that was entitled My Day. It ran 6 days a week from 1935 to 1962, 47 years. And the only time she missed writing that column was when Franklin died, and then she only missed 4 days. She spoke regularly on the radio. She was toured as a lecturer. She paid sympathetic visits to miners in Appalachia, to some slum dwellers in Puerto Rico, and to sharecroppers in the South. These well-publicized trips called attention to the plight of these American citizens, and it also created a feeling among Americans that somebody cared. She became an outspoken champion of civil rights. Now, when most of us think of Eleanor, we never think of her when it comes to cooking. But I'm here to tell you today that she is remembered for the meals that she served in the White House. She is remembered and noted to this day because those meals were so terrible. She hired the notorious Mrs. Henrietta Nesbitt, who for 12 years would produce meals so gray, so drooping, so inept that they became a White House legend. It was an unwritten rule that if you were invited to dine at the White House, you really should eat before you went. Now, I know you're a busy group of people, and many will go home tonight to prepare dinner. So I'm going to give you one of her recipes. You don't need to get out a pencil. You'll be able to remember it. It's called eggs Mexicali. You take cooked rice, you put sliced bananas on the top, and you top it with a fried egg. Bet you can't wait to make that one. The president was known for his fine palate, and he suffered bravely through these meals. They said he rarely complained or interfered, and some people say maybe the reason for that was she was paying him back for that infidelity. But if that's true, it doesn't explain why the White House guests had to suffer. Eleanor now would go on to publish and author 27 books. She would write 800 columns and 555 articles. She would answer 175,000 letters each year when she was in the White House. Now, she couldn't personally answer every single letter, but she would insist that it be answered appropriately by someone within the government. One letter she got came from a young woman named Bertha Brody, who apologized for her handwriting. She said she had great difficulty writing because her back was crooked. She said she had to walk bent sideways. So Eleanor wrote her an encouraging letter, and Eleanor arranged for a specialist to examine Bertha. And then she arranged for a subsequent surgery. She visited Bertha in the hospital. She helped her find a job. She attended her wedding, and she became godmother to her child. And that's what I call being a real friend. There was a major confrontation at this time with the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Eleanor was proud of her Revolutionary War ancestry, and she was a member of the DAR. But this organization denied the great black contralto, Marian Anderson, the use of their hall in Washington, D.C. for a concert. They said no black artist would be permitted in Constitution Hall. That was the only concert hall that was big enough to hold all of Marian's fans. So Eleanor resigned in protest, and later the Department of Interior scheduled a free open-air concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and over 75,000 people gathered to hear that magnificent voice in that memorable concert. Now, not everybody loved Eleanor. Some criticized her. They called her a do-gooder, a busybody, even a socialist. And one of her fiercest critics was J. Edgar Hoover, who hated Mrs. Roosevelt. He called her un-American. He kept a voluminous file on her. But she was determined she would live her own life, and she would not be dictated to by anyone. During Franklin's campaign for his second term, the popular First Lady joined him. He won a resounding victory, defeating Alf Landon of Kansas. It was the biggest popular plurality ever recorded by an American citizen. And now, in his second term, she continued with her travels. And when she returned, she would always meet with FDR over an informal dinner where she would report her valuable assessments. She was also influential in recommending appointments, especially of qualified, gifted women. There were matters that they always strongly disagreed upon. One of the major issues was civil rights legislation. Franklin had to walk a political tightrope, while Eleanor could advocate her personal point of view, and sometimes their opinions differed. They might not always agree, but everybody knew where the First Lady stood on the various issues. Now the world was being gripped by a new crisis, one that was occurring in Germany with Adolf Hitler. Franklin was being urged to run for an unprecedented third term, and Eleanor was against it. She felt he had already done his part. But at the Chicago Convention in 1940, Franklin won renomination on the first ballot. Franklin went on to win his third term by defeating Wendell Willkie, and it would be a very stressful time for Eleanor. All 4 of her sons had now been called into active duty. And then Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, and changes came about throughout America and at the White House. Franklin asked his wife to become a goodwill ambassador and to go to on various wartime trips for him. Her first job was to fly to England in 1942 to study the women's war effort and their military preparedness. She would go on to travel 23,000 miles in a cramped, unheated bomber. She was allowed only 44 pounds of luggage, and that had to include her typewriter. And during this grueling 5-week trip, she lost 30 pounds. Some saw her as a pest, but to the 400,000 servicemen she visited, she was a warm and welcome figure from home. And as the war progressed, the toll it was taking became evident on FDR. But in spite of concerns about his health, there was no doubt that he would run for a 4th term. Victory was in sight, and Franklin wanted to help establish a lasting peace. And he did win an unprecedented 4th term, defeating Governor Tom Dewey by more than 3.5 million votes. It was a tribute to his wartime leadership. After his 1945 inauguration, he would meet with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta. Remember the big 3? And when he came back to report on that meeting to Congress, many were shocked by his haggard appearance, by his apparent ill health. and they were right. Just a few months later, on April 12, 1945, Eleanor received word that her husband had died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage at his Warm Springs, Georgia spa. And now, with somber dignity, she did what had to be done. She personally informed Vice President Harry Truman. She notified the children. She went to Warm Springs to bring back the body. And when she got there, she received another terrible shock. She asked for a detailed account of his last hours, and at that point, she learned that Lucy Mercer Rutherford, the woman he had had that affair with years ago, had been there with JFK, with FDR. I have no idea why that Freudian slip came in there. She also learned that Franklin had been with Lucy numerous other times over recent years. She again, though, kept that hurt private, and she continued on with her duties. There was a simple service at the White House. The only piece of jewelry she wore in her widow's dress was a gold fleur-de-lis pin that he had given her on their wedding day 40 years before. She took off her wedding ring and left it with him in the open casket. After Franklin's death, she told a reporter, "The story is over." But she was so wrong. The story certainly wasn't over. Eleanor's story was just beginning. She was 60 years old. She had been Franklin's wife and partner for 40 years, and now she was on her own. She said, "For the first time in my life, I can say just what I want. It's wonderful to be free." She would now continue to travel the world, to witness, to write, and to speak out. She didn't mellow. She was still controversial. She got in a bitter disagreement with Cardinal Spellman of New York in 1949. She spoke against federal funds for parochial schools, and he charged her with discrimination and said her position was unworthy of an American mother. And she reported that the worthiness of all human beings was in the hands of God. Well, it all ended with tea at Hyde Park and a joint statement asserting the right of free speech to all. To the end of her life, she would remain committed to her liberal vision. Franklin had always thought in terms of politics. She always thought in terms of people. She had become the voice of a common humanity which had had no voice before. President Truman called her personally to tell her that Japan had surrendered on August 19, 1945. He now asked her to serve as one of the 5 American delegates to the UN General Assembly at their very first meeting. And with a little bit of reservation, she did accept. She was the only woman, and the other 4 delegates weren't too happy with their lone female colleague. She was assigned to Committee 3. This was a group that dealt with humanitarianism, education, and cultural issues, and it was thought that Eleanor couldn't do too much damage here. Oh boy, were they wrong. To everyone's surprise, Committee 3 turned out to be a hotbed of controversy. More than 1 million refugees had been stranded in displaced persons camps throughout Europe. The Soviets wanted forced repatriation, with everyone being returned to their original homeland. But many of these people were from Eastern Europe. They were now anti-communist, and they feared being sent back to their former homelands. They feared they might face imprisonment or even death. The United States and the other Western nations supported the right of political asylum. They wanted all of the people to be able to choose their own homes. And that issue of refugee repatriation was given to, Committee 3. Eleanor would be the one to speak for the United States. She would speak without notes against Andrei Vyshinsky, the head of the Soviet delegation. He was a powerful orator and was also known for having a great legal mind. They made their presentations. and the General Assembly voted against repatriation and voted that the refugees should be free to choose their own homes. It was a political triumph for the United States and a personal victory for Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor would serve as a UN delegate throughout both of Truman's terms. In 1946, she was elected to the Human Rights Commission. They were instructed to draft an international Bill of Rights, and for the next 2 years, she would mediate between the clashing views of delegates from different nations and different cultures. She drove them, and she drove herself tirelessly, insisting on 14 and 16-hour days. The tired delegate from Panama came to her and begged Mrs. Roosevelt to please remember that the UN delegates had human rights too. And she replied, "Your sessions could be shorter if your speeches weren't so long-winded." And finally, when it was completed and voted on and overwhelmingly approved, something happened that had never happened before and has never happened since at the United Nations. The delegates rose en masse to give astounding ovation to a single delegate. It was a moving tribute to Eleanor's leadership. To this day, that Bill of Rights stands as the most widely recognized statement of the rights to which every person on this planet is entitled. Throughout her years as a UN delegate, she would continue to lecture, broadcast, and write, and that would include that popular newspaper column. Her continuing popularity astounded politicians and infuriated some of them. In 1948, she was placed first among the nation's 10 most popular personalities, ahead of President Truman and Generals MacArthur and Eisenhower. The Gallup poll annually put her at the list of the most admired women in the world. She continued to be an influential figure in democratic politics. She continued to speak out forcefully on nuclear rights, civil rights, and disarmament. She traveled the globe as a goodwill ambassador and later as a private citizen. When Eisenhower was elected president, he did not appoint her to her post at the UN. So now she traveled for the AAUN. This was the American Association for the United Nations. And in 1954, that group celebrated her 70th birthday, and they had a festive fundraising dinner. More than 1,000 people attended, and that list included past and present heads of the United Nations, and it also included her old arch-rival, Andrei Vyshinsky from Russia. They hadn't expected him to come. They hadn't really assigned a seat. He said, "I don't care where you sit. Put me. Any place is fine. I just had to come to pay tribute to a gallant lady." He said, "I'll be glad to sit anywhere." When Kennedy was inaugurated in 1961, she did accept several assignments from him. She did become a UN delegate again. She also served on the Advisory Council of the Peace Corps and agreed to chair Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. But in 1962, she began to fail. She was diagnosed with a complicated and untreatable blood disorder. She died on November 7th after a severe stroke. She was 78 years old. It was 17 years since Franklin's death, and she was still America's most admired woman. She was buried next to her husband in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park, New York, the family home and the site of Franklin's Library. President Kennedy, former Presidents Eisenhower and Truman attended, along with the future president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So here we are, Women's History Month. Why are we here? What do we remember her for? Well, we remember her, for one thing, for offering hope everywhere she went, for being that voice to the hopeless, for believing so strongly and promoting tirelessly union rights, civil rights, women's rights, for seeking alliances, for creating community, for working with movements, for balancing conflict with confrontation, for controversy with compromise, for power with action. Claire Booth Luce, the writer, said very simply, "No woman has ever so comforted the distressed or so distressed the comfortable." Unfortunately, though, many of the battles she fought for are once again before us all. There is still homelessness in America. This world is still not at peace. The racial divide is still among us. That struggle for human rights, women's rights, all continue throughout the world. The beat goes on. Her battles, our battles continue, but we can be grateful for the example that the remarkable Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the world, gave to us all. Thank you so much for letting me share with you. Thank you. Thank you.